The North Atlantic, early spring of 1943. The sea was steel gray, cold as iron, its surface whipped into sharp ridges by a biting wind out of the northwest. Beneath those restless swells, in a world of humming machinery and stale air, a German submarine moved slowly eastward, running silent and deep. Inside the hull of U-405, Oberleutnant See Karl-Heinz Schröder stood near the attack periscope, one hand resting on the brass housing, the other tracing the condensation dripping from the overhead piping. The temperature in the control room hovered just above freezing. Though sweat ran down the backs of the men working the dive planes, every sound seemed magnified. The rhythmic pulse of the diesel engines when surfaced, the faint whine of electric motors now that they were submerged, and somewhere aft, the steady ticking of a clock that no one dared look at too long. They had been hunting for 2 weeks. Somewhere to the west lay a convoy, 40 merchant ships bound for Britain, and the men of the U-boat arm still believed, or wanted to believe, that a skilled commander and a well-trained crew could bring such convoys to ruin. The promise had been drummed into them from the first days at training school in Kiel, that a handful of submarines, each costing a fraction of a single Allied freighter, could starve an island nation into surrender. It was a beautiful logic, cold, mathematical, almost elegant in its cruelty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But the ocean that morning felt different. The hydrophone operator had reported distant propeller beats, faint and overlapping, too numerous to count. It was as if the sea itself was murmuring with unseen engines. Schröder had ordered a slow ascent, just enough to bring the periscope above the surface. He raised it carefully, cutting through the water like a silver needle. The sight froze him. On the horizon, spread across the swell in every direction, moved ships small, boxy silhouettes with flight decks glinting under the pale sun. One carrier, then another still. He counted until he lost track, dozens of them. Their wakes crisscrossed like white scars on the dark sea. Around them, destroyers darted like wolves. Above them, aircraft circled, dipping low and vanishing into clouds. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the first officer whispered, "Flugzeugträger, so viele." Aircraft carriers, so many? What they were seeing was not illusion. It was a hunter-killer group, one of the new Allied escort formations that now blanketed the Atlantic. Small carriers, each converted from merchant hulls, escorted by destroyers and frigates, patrolling the very ocean that had once belonged to the U-boats. To the men of U-405, it was as if the entire Allied fleet had descended upon them. They did not yet know the full truth that by that spring, the Allies had deployed nearly 50 escort carriers across the Atlantic, coordinating with radar, high-frequency direction finding, and long-range aircraft. They did not know that the days of the Wolfpack were numbered, but they could feel it. In the silence that filled the control room, that realization settled heavier than the ocean above them. The U-boat war had begun as an affair of hunters. In the early years, 1940, 1941, the sea had been a battlefield of stealth and nerve. German submariners spoke of the happy time, those months when British convoys sailed without enough escorts, when torpedoes struck freighters almost nightly. In the bars of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, young officers toasted each other with French cognac, certain that they were invincible. The Kriegsmarine's propaganda fed that belief. Posters in the bases at Brest and Wilhelmshaven showed sleek grey submarines. Slicing through stylized waves, the Iron Cross emblazoned above slogans like "Der Atlantik ist unser," "The Atlantic is ours." Newsreels showed smiling crews returning from patrols, wreaths on the conning tower, Admiral Dönitz himself waiting on the pier to congratulate them. Success was measured in tonnage. Each ship sunk tallied neatly in the records of the BDU, the U-boat command, as if war were an equation of steel and displacement. And for a time, it seemed true. In 1940, German submarines had sunk nearly 1 million tons of Allied shipping in a single month. Convoy routes were shattered, Britain rationed food, and Churchill himself admitted that the only thing that truly frightened him was the U-boat peril. To a young officer like Schröder, fresh from the Naval Academy at Flensburg, those figures were intoxicating. He and his classmates studied tactics, drawn from Dönitz's own experience, the coordinated Wolfpack attacks, the night surface runs, the silent submerged pursuits. Every lesson carried the same implication. that courage and precision could overcome superior numbers. Yet by the winter of 1942, cracks were showing. The new Allied radar sets could detect periscopes protruding just a few inches above water. Coastal command aircraft roamed farther from shore, and in the hidden war of mathematics and radio waves, Allied cryptographers at Bletchley Park had begun reading German Enigma signals again after a brief blackout. The wolves were being tracked without knowing it. Still, within the U-boat arm, faith persisted. Dönitz demanded it. He was a man of iron discipline and single-minded conviction, convinced that the submarine was the decisive weapon of modern war. When new Type 7 and Type IX boats rolled out of the yards, he saw them not as machines, but as proof that Germany's will remained unbroken. Orders went out to the crews with phrases like, "Glauben Sie an Ihr Boot," believe in your boat. And they did. They believed in the smooth hum of their diesels, in the clean geometry of attack tables, in the deadly accuracy of the G7E torpedo. They believed that for every convoy they attacked, another small piece of Britain's resolve would crumble. What they did not believe, what they could not yet imagine, was that an entire industrial continent had turned its attention toward the ocean, and that the ocean itself would soon become a kind of machine. By the spring of 1943, American shipyards were launching new vessels at a rate that defied comprehension. The Liberty ship, simple, ugly, and mass-produced, could be built in less than 6 weeks. Escort carriers, assembled from merchant hulls, slid down the ways at places like Tacoma, Mobile, and Newark. Each carried a squadron of Grumman Avengers and Wildcats, aircraft fitted with radar sets that could sweep the waves for miles. The German naval staff tracked these developments with unease. Reports from the Western Approaches Command suggested the Allies were closing the mid-Atlantic air gap, that void of several hundred miles where no aircraft had previously been able to patrol. If true, it meant the convoys would never again be unguarded. But such information came slowly to the men at sea. For crews like Schröder's, each patrol was its own universe, a self-contained world of condensation, diesel fumes, and repetition. They lived by the rhythm of the watch, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, their sleep disturbed by the groaning of the hull as it flexed under pressure. Meals were taken standing up: canned pork, black bread gone moldy by the 3rd week, coffee substitute brewed from roasted barley. Letters from home arrived rarely, censored and smudged with damp. In that isolation, belief hardened into something like religion. The Atlantic was their cathedral, vast, cold, and merciless. Each attack was a ritual act. When a torpedo found its mark, when they surfaced to see a freighter burning on the horizon, it confirmed that faith. Until days like this, when they raised the periscope and saw the sea crawling with enemy carriers, not one, not two, but a horizon full of them, the old equations no longer made sense. The hunter was surrounded by predators of a different kind, larger, faster, and more numerous than he had ever imagined. Oberleutnant Schröder lowered the periscope and stared at the metal floor. "Das ist unmöglich," he murmured. "Impossible." But the sonar operator's headphones crackled again, the unmistakable hum of aircraft engines overhead, then the faint splash of sonobuoys entering the water. The Atlantic had changed. It was no longer a void. It was a network, a grid of eyes and ears that stretched from Newfoundland to Gibraltar. And somewhere in the growing hum above them, men in aircraft listened to the ocean, waiting for the faint metallic echo of a submarine hull. The belief that had sustained Schröder's generation, that the sea would always offer hiding places, was dying. The surface of the Atlantic looked deceptively calm that evening. The light was fading, and the sea rolled under a low ceiling of cloud. To the men aboard U-405, it was a familiar hour, the hour when submarines traditionally surfaced to charge batteries, air out the compartments, and send radio reports to the BDU headquarters back in Lorient. But Schröder hesitated. He could feel something in the air, not superstition, exactly, but the sharp intuition that had kept him alive through 6 patrols. He climbed up through the conning tower hatch, his breath turning to vapor in the cold air. The wind carried the smell of salt and oil. All seemed clear. And then, on the horizon, he saw the faint outline of a shadow too broad, too square to be a merchantman. A carrier, perhaps 20 miles off, its flight deck lit by a line of pale lamps. He knew then that they were no longer alone. He ordered an immediate dive. The hull shuddered as ballast tanks flooded. The sea closed above them with a hollow sound like a door slamming shut. Moments later, The hydrophone operator called out, voice shaking slightly. Propellers multiple, fast-moving, bearing 070 to 150. Aircraft, destroyers. The entire sea alive with pursuit. For 2 hours they listened. Engines stopped, drifting in silence. Somewhere above, the droning of engines came and went. Occasionally, a dull thud rolled through the water depth charges falling far off, perhaps meant for another submarine. But each explosion carried a message. The hunters were everywhere. The truth was that the Germans had not yet grasped how completely the Atlantic had changed. The convoy battles of early 1943 had marked a quiet revolution in naval warfare. Until then, success had come from tactics bold commanders striking at night, coordinated wolfpack attacks directed by long-wave radio from occupied France. Now, success came from systems, radar, sonar, high-frequency direction finding, and air coverage that reached farther each month. The Allies had learned that victory over the U-boats required not brilliance but saturation to fill the ocean with so many sensors, so many eyes, that invisibility itself ceased to exist. The first to understand this shift were the men aboard those small escort carriers. Converted from merchant hulls, each carried only 24 aircraft, but when deployed in groups, they turned the convoy into a moving fortress. The British called them Mack ships, the Americans, jeep carriers. To the Germans who glimpsed them through periscopes, they looked like factories of death. Each Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber aboard those carriers carried radar, depth charges, and most frightening of all the Mark 24 mine, an acoustic homing torpedo. It was called Fido. Launched from altitude, it did not rely on sight or coordinates. It listened. It heard the whir of propellers, locked on, and followed. Once dropped, there was no defense but silence, and even silence was often too loud. In the spring of 1943, U-boat Command sent more than 50 submarines into the mid-Atlantic to attack convoy ONS-5, a lumbering procession of merchant ships heading from Liverpool to Halifax. It was meant to be the decisive counterstroke proof that the U-boat arm still ruled the ocean. Instead, it became a funeral. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For 5 days, the battle raged under black skies. At first, the Germans scored successes. 10 ships went down in a single night. But the escorts, newly equipped with centimetric radar that could pierce the surface clutter, began to strike back with a precision never seen before. Aircraft from escort carrier HMS Biter prowled overhead, even through fog and darkness, guided by homing beacons and vector instructions from the convoy's escort group. When U-405 approached to attack, a destroyer suddenly turned toward her with uncanny accuracy. It was as if the British could read her position by instinct. In reality, it was by mathematics. The Allies had triangulated her radio transmissions through Huff-Duff high-frequency direction, finding which could pinpoint a U-boat's bearing within minutes of a signal. Each time Schröder's radio officer tapped a message to Lorient, Allied operators on multiple ships and stations drew intersecting lines on transparent charts, finding the submarine's approximate position within a few dozen miles. The Hunter had become the tracked. Convoy ONS-5 ended with 13 U-boats destroyed 1/4 of the attacking force. To the men who survived, the message was unmistakable. The Atlantic was no longer theirs. In the weeks that followed, Admiral Dönitz ordered a halt to all operations in the North Atlantic. It was the first time since 1939 that the Wolfpacks had been withdrawn. In his diary he wrote tersely, "The enemy air forces now dominate the Central Atlantic. Our losses are unsustainable." For the crews in the bases of Western France, the pause felt like an admission of defeat. Boats returned with half their crews gone, their conning towers scarred, their morale hollowed. Men drank silently in the mess halls of Lorient, staring at the walls covered with photographs of crews who would never return. In the corner, the propaganda posters still proclaimed victory. "Wir halten den Atlantik frei." We keep the Atlantic free. But everyone knew the truth. Schröder spent those weeks overseeing repairs, studying reports from other commanders. He read the interrogation notes of captured British officers, trying to understand how the Allies coordinated so effectively. The numbers were staggering. In 1941, the Allies had fewer than a dozen escort carriers. By mid-1943, they had over 40 in operation, with 20 more under construction. Each could carry a dozen or more aircraft. Combined with land-based patrols, they could maintain continuous air cover across almost the entire transatlantic route. The change was not simply one of equipment, but of philosophy. Where the German Navy had built exquisite machines, each U-boat, a handcrafted weapon of steel and precision, the Allies built systems. They treated the ocean as a production line. Convoys, carriers, aircraft, radar stations, all synchronized by radio and mathematics. For men raised in the traditions of seamanship and honor, that realization was devastating. Schröder had been taught that war was a contest of courage, man against man, ship against ship. Now he saw that courage mattered less than computation. The enemy did not need to see him. They only needed to detect the faint signature of his existence. In one report he read that Summer, a British escort carrier group led by USS Bogue, had destroyed 6 submarines in 6 weeks. Another, centered around USS Card, had recorded 5 kills in a single patrol. The names of the sunken boats U-118, U-128, U-402 filled entire pages of the Bitu log. Each represented 50 men sealed forever beneath the Atlantic. Among U-boat crews, superstition began to replace faith. Some sailors refused to touch the number 13. Others carried small talismans, coins, or scraps of cloth from home. They spoke in whispers of aircraft that could see through clouds, of buoys that listened to the sea. They called them Todesoren, ears of death. By the autumn of 1943, the old rhythm of the war was gone. No more coordinated wolf packs, no more triumphant homecomings. Each U-boat now hunted alone, avoiding contact, diving at the first hint of aircraft. The German term U-Boot-Krieg, submarine war, no longer meant attack, it meant endurance. Schröder's next patrol took him into the Bay of Biscay, where Allied aircraft prowled night and day. The Luftwaffe provided cover where it could, but their range was short, their fuel limited. On one overcast evening, as U-405 tried to reach deeper waters, a Liberator bomber appeared through the clouds and dropped flares that turned the sea white as snow. In those seconds of illumination, every man on deck saw the vastness of the enemy's reach, an aircraft 3,000 feet above, guided by radar, supported by a fleet hundreds of miles away. They crash-dived, the conning tower barely slipping beneath the surface before the first depth charges fell. For the next 6 hours, they were hunted without pause. The sea became a hammer, pounding from every direction. The pressure gauges trembled, light bulbs shattered. One man began praying aloud until the first officer silenced him. Finally, near dawn, the sounds faded. They had escaped, but something inside them had broken. When they surfaced, the horizon was empty, no aircraft, no ships, only the indifferent gray of the ocean. Schröder stared at it for a long time. He thought of the posters, the parades, the promises of victory, and he realized that belief, once shattered, does not return. The Atlantic had once been a battlefield. Now it was a graveyard of theories of tactics, of pride, of the idea that human will could outmatch machinery. The men of the U-boat arm had believed they were the masters of an invisible empire, but as they looked upon the endless horizon filled with unseen enemies, they understood that empire had never been theirs. It belonged to those who could fill it with steel, with aircraft, with factories, and with mathematics. By the beginning of 1944, the harbors of France told their own story. Where once the quays of Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Pallice had echoed with brass bands and the voices of cheering dockworkers, now there was only the clang of hammers and the smell of diesel exhaust. Submarines returned fewer and fewer each month. Some limped into port with holes welded over, their decks scarred by shrapnel. Others simply never came back. Of the 350 boats that had sailed the Atlantic in the first years of the war, more than 2/3 now lay at the bottom. The walls of the pens were covered with black-framed photographs, crew portraits, each marked with a small iron cross and a date. The dates came closer together as the years went on, until they blurred into a single, continuous mourning. Oberleutnant Schröder walked the corridors of the base with the air of a man half awake. The mess smelled of mold and cheap schnapps. Propaganda films still played in the canteen newsreels showing U-boats slicing through calm waters, commanders saluting on the bridge, but nobody watched them anymore. The faces in the room were gaunt, hollow-eyed. They spoke in fragments, about weather, about repairs, never about the sea. By that year, the War of the Atlantic had ceased to be a contest. It had become an attrition, so one-sided that even the mathematics defied reason. Allied shipyards produced merchant vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. The United States alone launched nearly 18 million tons of new shipping in 1944. Escort carriers multiplied until they seemed endless. Bogue, Card, Croatan, Block Island, Guadalcanal, names that surfaced in U-boat reports like recurring nightmares. Each one represented not a single ship, but a moving province of air power, a mobile sensor array stretching across the sea. German industry could not answer in kind. The new Type XXI electric boats, with streamlined hulls and advanced batteries, remained mostly on the drawing board. Allied bombing raids shattered shipyards at Bremen and Hamburg. Steel grew scarce, so did trained men. Dönitz begged for resources, but the Führer had shifted his faith to miracle weapons of the air and land. The sea no longer held his interest. For the men who still went out, the patrol became an act of fatalism. They sailed knowing that survival itself was improbable. In some flotillas, more than 80% of crews never returned. Letters were left unsealed on bunks, to be forwarded home if the boat did not come back. New recruits, boys barely 20, filled the gaps left by veterans. They were told the old slogans, but even the instructors delivered them without conviction. Schröder's last patrol began in late spring of 1944. U-405 slipped from Lorient under a moonless sky, escorted through the minefields by a harbor tug. The crew lined the deck in silence. Somewhere in the darkness, Allied aircraft droned. They all knew the odds. Their mission was no longer to attack convoys but to report enemy movements, to act as eyes for a fleet that no longer existed. They moved cautiously along the Bay of Biscay, surfacing only at night, their radar detector humming faintly. Twice they were forced to crash dive under pursuit from aircraft they never saw. On the 10th day, the radio operator intercepted an English broadcast. The invasion of France had begun. Normandy. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men. The long-promised Second Front. For the men listening in the control room, the words sounded unreal. They had fought for control of the Atlantic for 5 years. Now the enemy had crossed it, as if it were a river. The next morning, a sonar contact appeared, rapid, distant, fading in and out. Schröder ordered a slow turn to investigate. Through the periscope he saw nothing but grey water. Then, suddenly, a formation of aircraft appeared above the clouds. Avengers again. They circled, dropped something small and metallic that splashed into the sea. Within minutes, the hydrophone reported the pinging of active sonar all around them, a lattice of sound closing in. The first depth charges fell at noon. The boat shook violently, lights flickered, gauges burst. Men clutched pipes and prayed silently. For 4 hours the attack continued, systematic, methodical, almost mechanical in its precision. It was not the chaotic violence of the early war. It was execution by calculation. When at last they surfaced that night, the horizon glowed faintly with the reflection of burning ships, Allied landing craft, German coastal batteries, the distant thunder of invasion. Schröder stood on the bridge, rain mixing with oil on his face. He realized that the war he had trained for, the duel between hunter and prey, had ended long ago. What remained was the collapse of an idea, that courage and craftsmanship could hold back a world of factories. He scuttled his boat 3 weeks later after mechanical failure left them stranded near Biscay. The crew was captured by a British corvette. They were given tea, dry clothes, and medical attention, small mercies that felt like humiliation. One British officer, noting their condition, remarked quietly, "You were brave men, but you were sent against machines." Schröder never forgot that sentence. After Germany's surrender in May of 1945, the remnants of the U-boat fleet were gathered and destroyed under Operation Deadlight. More than 120 submarines were towed into the open sea and sunk by gunfire and explosives. The Allies feared that if they left them intact, they might someday return. Photographs from that winter show the sleek grey hulls lined up in rows, their decks awash in cold rain, waiting for scuttling charges. Each boat carried ghosts, men who had once believed the Atlantic belonged to them. In the decades that followed, historians tried to measure what had happened, the statistics of tonnage, the curves of production, the charts of loss and replacement. But behind those numbers lay a deeper truth. The Battle of the Atlantic was not merely a contest between navies, it was the transformation of war itself. The ocean, once the realm of chance and seamanship, became a theater of information, of radar echoes, radio bearings, and industrial rhythm. For the surviving German submariners, that transformation was a wound that never closed. Some became engineers, others fishermen, a few joined the post-war navy. Many avoided the sea entirely. When they met in reunions years later, they spoke less about battles than about sounds. The hum of aircraft engines, the metallic heartbeat of sonar, the final hammering of depth charges. Those sounds had marked the end of an era when men still believed the sea could be mastered by will alone. Oberleutnant Schröder seldom spoke of his patrols after the war. In his few surviving letters, written from a small village near Kiel, he mentioned only once the day he saw the horizon filled with carriers. "It was then," he wrote, "that I understood what defeat looks like. It is not when you are destroyed, but when you realize you have been replaced." The irony of that realization lingered long after the wrecks rusted away. The submariners who had once hunted across a limitless ocean had discovered that the ocean itself could be mapped, measured, and occupied not by empire, but by machinery. The Atlantic, which had seemed eternal and indifferent, had become a human instrument, a grid of steel and signal. By the end of 1945, the war's arithmetic was complete. 784 German U-boats lost, more than 30,000 submariners dead, a mortality rate higher than any other branch of any major service. The men who survived carried with them the knowledge that they had lived through the last war fought between men and the first fought between systems. When the winds returned to the Atlantic each winter, sweeping across the empty seas where the convoys once sailed, they carried no sound of propellers, no echo of engines, only the endless rhythm of waves over steel graves far below. And down there, in the cold and pressure and dark, lay the silent memory of a generation who had believed they ruled the ocean, until they looked upon 50 escort carriers and realized that the ocean no longer belonged to them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.